This set of PowerPoints is going to talk about genetics. This is Chapter 3. The influence of heredity on development. So what is meant by heredity? Well, heredity is the biological transmission of traits. Genetics is the biological study of this heredity. So in this class, we're going to just be covering a very brief overview of genetics. And if you ever had a basic biology class, this is going to be a review. So what are chromosomes and genes? Well, chromosomes are found in every cell. We have 23 pairs of these rod-shaped structures. Genes are segments within the chromosomes. They regulate the development of traits, and these can be either a single gene or many combined genes. And we have approximately 20,000 to 25,000 genes in every cell. DNA are long strands that make up genes, often referred to as the double spiral helix. And it basically is our blueprint of who we are. Here's a nice diagram to show how little things really are. So here we have a cell, and in the cell is a nucleus. And these little rod X-shaped figures are chromosomes. And then within the chromosomes is the DNA. So things are really quite amazing when you think about how much material is in a cell and the structure of cells. But each cell contains all of our genetic material. And whether it turns into a piece of skin, a fingernail, an eyelash, it depends upon what it's told to turn into. It's really quite interesting. So what happens during cell division? Well, we have 23 chromosome pairs which divide, and they result in a new cell. There's 22 pairs of autosomes, and the 23rd pair is the sex chromosomes. So again, if you've had basic biology, you know that an XX results in a female, and a chromosome combination of an XY turns into a male. And that all developing embryos begin to develop as a female. And if it has the genetic code that it's an XY, then it floods the developing embryo with testosterone, and the embryo begins to develop as a male. So how are twins formed? Well, when a cell becomes fertilized, it becomes a zygote. And a monozygotic twins are that you have one cell that is fertilized, and during cell division, for some reason, it splits into two separate developing embryos. Therefore, you have identical twins. With dizygotic twins, for some reason, two ovums were released, and they both got fertilized. So then you can have either two girls, two boys, or a boy and a girl. But these developing embryos that will develop into fetuses are going to be as different as siblings because they both have their own specific genetic makeup. So as far as dominant and recessive traits, typically dominant traits are the traits that get expressed, and recessive traits may or may not be expressed. We're all carriers of a lot of genetic material that is passed down from generation to generation. And it may be expressed if it is paired with another recessive gene. There's a huge range of genetic abnormalities that can occur. And there's a nice chart in your textbook that you should read and review so that when somebody mentions a specific genetic abnormality, you have some idea of what that is. But remember that understanding the etiology means why something has happened, often is very difficult. So 50% of the gene pool comes from the mother, 50% of the gene pool comes from the father, and so both parents contribute to the future child. Down syndrome is caused by an extra chromosome on the 21st pair. The probability of having a child with Down syndrome increases with age, both of the mother and the father. There are certain physical characteristics that we see with individuals who have Down syndrome. There's specific facial features, cognitive, physical deficiencies, and children are slower to develop. Now remember that with any either a developmental delay or disability is that each person experiences it differently, and to be very careful and to make sure that you learn about the person first and not just assume that you know how they experience their disability or their delay. The other thing is to always put the person first. In other words, it's not the Downs kid or the autistic child, but it's the child with Down syndrome or the child with autism. So always put the person first when you're talking about them. Now here's a picture of a child who has Down syndrome. You can see a little bit about the round face. They have a little bit of a slanted eyes. Now, often children with Down syndrome have difficulty learning to talk because they have very thick tongues. So they often have delayed speech. Fragile X syndrome is one of the most common forms of inherited intellectual disability. It's passed down on the X chromosome through a weak chromosomal attachment. How it got its name is that when it's looked at under a microscope, is that the X chromosome is attached by a very fine line of K molecules, and it looks like it's going to break off. So that's how it got its name. It is, again, a very common form of inherited intellectual disability, and again, that people that inherit it can also experience it to varying degrees. So once again, it's important to get to know the person first before making assumptions about how a certain disability or syndrome will impact them. Genetic counseling and prenatal testing can help a couple understand maybe their risks of transmitting certain kinds of genetic abnormalities, or whether or not they have a child who might be born with a disability. Amniocentesis is one way of determining that, and that is done usually around the 14th to 18th or 16th week. And there's other genetic tests available also. Sonograms used to be the way that we would peer inside the womb while a fetus was still developing. Now we have 3D and 4D scans that are much more sophisticated. The 4D scans actually will show movement, and it's to the point now where we can really watch the development of a fetus in utero. It's very exciting. Remember, I mentioned that we're carriers of a lot of genetic material that does not get expressed, and that's considered our genotype. Our phenotype are the actual traits that are expressed. And this might be variations in hair color or skin color, eye color, those types of things. Genes also come together and have what we consider to be like an additive effect. So it's what gives us variation, it's what makes us interesting, and so that we don't all look the same. Many researchers are trying to understand how genetics really play into how we develop. And there's different ways in which we research this. We certainly look at kinship studies, which means close relatives, twin studies, whether it's monozygotic twins or dizygotic twins, and then obviously adoptive studies. It used to be historically that if a pair of twins were given up for adoption, that sometimes it's easier to have one child adopted versus twins. And so historically, sometimes children would be separated and would find themselves or find their families later in life, and then be kind of amazed or interested in similarities that they had, even though maybe they were raised in very different families. So conception, against all odds. So once an ovum is released and it's fertilized by a sperm, it becomes a zygote. But more than 50% of fertilized ovums fail to implant. During an ejaculation, there's approximately 400 million sperm released. About 1,000 arrive into the vicinity of the ovum, and it's believed that they find the ovum through smell. Once a sperm fertilizes the ovum creates some kind of a barrier around it so that no other sperm can permeate it. There's a range of factors that contribute to why a man might be infertile. Some might be low sperm count, abnormal sperm, diseases. Causes may be both genetic and environmental. Infertility in women can be irregular or failure to ovulate, declining hormone levels due to age, infections, obstructed fallopian tubes, a variety of other things too. There's a variety of ways to help couples or an individual have a child. There's artificial insemination, there's in vitro fertilization, there's donor, where a person donates either an ovum or the sperm or both. You can have a surrogate that carries the child for an individual or a couple, and then there's adoption.